Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining this call today. We're really excited to be sharing information about the Wild Oysters Project, which you might have heard some information about over the last month with the oysters going in at Conwy Marina. So during this presentation, we've got just a few slides about native oysters, in case some of you might not be familiar, kind of running through the kind of oysters that you can find in the UK. A bit about what they can do for us and why we're hoping to restore them, and introducing you to the Wild Oysters Project in terms of the 3 sites we've got around the UK. And then Maria will be covering some information locally to your site towards the end of the presentation as well. And we're very happy to answer any questions, and we are hoping for this to kind of be informal, so do feel free to, as Maria said, put your hand up and ask any questions as we go along. So if we go to the next slide then, please. So when we say the word oyster, it's interesting to know what first springs to mind. And I think for a lot of people, it's oysters on a kind of dinner plate in a restaurant with a glass of champagne. And I think there's a poll that might be coming up now. Sorry, I'm trying to keep track of my screens for you to answer with what comes to mind when you think of oysters, although I might have spoilt it then by saying my assumptions. But yeah, so for most people, I think people are most familiar with them in a seafood restaurant. If we go to the next slide, please. And this is because we have a kind of humans have shared an intimate love affair with oysters. The Romans were particularly keen on the native oysters, and records show that they ate them in their thousands during feasts. And in the 19th century, more than 200 million native oysters were sold annually on the London market, and that was at a time that the London population was just that of 2 million. So people really loved oysters. So this image here, or painting, drawing, is from 1835, and it shows Oyster Day, which was when the first oysters arrived at Billingsgate Fish Market. And at that time, you could get a few oysters for just a few pennies. It was really cheap to buy oysters. And so they were a very common food source for many people during that time. Next slide, please, Maria. However, what a lot of people don't realise is that when oysters are in their natural habitat, based underwater, they come to life and they're capable of forming reef-like structures. So oysters tend to settle on top of one another, forming a 3-dimensional biodiverse habitat, which can attract a vast array of marine wildlife and biodiversity. So in these images here, you can see different kind of assemblages of oysters. Sometimes they can be found along with mussels. They can be found with other oyster species, for example, the Pacific oyster. And in that bottom right-hand image, you might be able to see a seahorse. So this is the Spiny Seahorse, and this image was taken in France. And it's a nice image showing that, you know, other marine wildlife can interact with kind of assemblages of oysters as well. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we just thought we'd include a bit of information about how to identify a native oyster. So they are rounded in shape and they have a kind of rough shell. They're pale yellow and green in colouring, and they can grow up to around 15 centimetres in shell height. You tend to find them within the shallow subtidal, coastal and estuarine habitat. Yeah, so this is kind of what they look like. They have 2 different shells. They have a lower valve that's convex, an upper valve that's flat, and they fit together to form that shell. So moving on to the next slide, please. So the Pacific oyster, which is the other oyster species that we can find in the UK, they have a slightly different shell where it's an elongated shell with sharp curved edges. They tend to be purple pink in coloration, have a bit more of a purple tinge to them. And they are found in the intertidal zone in coastal areas and muddy estuaries. And also in this middle image here, you can see that they often are kind of shown, you know, you can see them when you're along the coastline. So in some areas you may well have seen formations of Pacific oysters, and you can find them around the coastline of the UK and Ireland. And the Pacific oyster was introduced to UK waters in 1965, and this was to replenish low fishery stocks of native oysters. And they can be found in Cornwall, Devon, and elsewhere in the south of England as well. Next slide, please, Maria. So we've got just a few images to see if you can identify what you think this oyster is. So is it native or Pacific based on those images that we've just shown you? I think there's an option to take part in a poll now. I'll just wait 1 second. So remember, the things to look out for are the kind of edges of the shell, any particular kind of shape of that shell, any coloration that you might think. I might have to vote myself here to get that out of the way from my screen. Oh, we're on 50-50 at the moment. Val has answered Pacific. Okay, right, I'm going to click done on that poll. So I can let you know that these oysters on the screen now are Pacific oysters. It is a bit of a tricky image. I should have shown a more kind of top image of them, but yeah, these are the Pacific oysters. So if you go on to the next image, and you can have another vote on the next one. So do you think these are native or Pacific oysters? I think there should be another poll coming up.
Hi, it's Chris here. I'm not getting a poll here. I don't know if I've done something wrong or I need to activate something, but I can't see any poll. Ah,
that's strange. I'm afraid I'm not super clued up on
Well, if everybody else has got it and only me not, then don't worry about it. But if we've all lost it, then
feel free to answer in the text box instead, and I'll add that to the answers. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't also seem to have a poll available to me.
No probs. If you add your answer into the text chat, message chat thing.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can both see in the top right, there's like a speech bubble which says conversation. So whether you're able to open that up, you might find the poll in there, or if not, you can just type your answers.
No, I can't see the speech bubble, and I can't see where I would type my answer.
Oh, very strange.
Anyway,
not to worry. Okie dokie. So from the answers that I can see, and sorry if anyone's not been able to add their answers, from what I can see, the majority of people are right. So these are images of native oysters. So 87% are correct. So well done, everyone. Right, we'll move on to the next slide, please, Maria. So this slide here just shows them kind of side by side. So you can see the kind of shape differences inside the oyster themselves. They look relatively similar. As you can see on the left, those are shucked oysters that have been opened up, and you can see the insides. And then again in the other image, you can see the kind of shells and how different they look. I think the main difference for me that helps me identify them is the kind of curly edges and also the elongated shell of the Pacific oyster. So hopefully now if you see an oyster, whether it's in a restaurant or along the seashore, you might have some hints and tips to see which species it is. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Maria. So on the screen here, we've got a time-lapse video, and this is a time-lapse video of a 4-hour period. In the left-hand side, it's a tank with no oysters in it, and on the right, we've got a tank of around 15 to 20 oysters. So oysters are characterized by their water filtering abilities, and they feed on particles within the water column, such as algae and detritus, and they filter it out of the water column. And a single oyster can filter up to around 200 litres of water in just one day, which is around the size of your average bathtub. So you can see how when we manage to hopefully try and restore the species, we have an ecosystem that's powerful enough to vastly improve our coastal water quality. I really like that video. I think it's a really neat way of showing what oysters are going to be doing for us when they are in the nurseries underneath the pontoons. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, and I think I'm handing over to Maria at this point.
Yes, here we go, back. Okie dokie. So, unfortunately, our European native oysters, even though they are brilliant, they have faced a population decline of 95% since the 1950s. And this has been due to disease, habitat loss, and overexploitation. So in the UK, we have just a few remaining populations, which can be found on the west coast of Scotland, small population in South Wales, and also south of England in areas such as the Solent and the River Fell. But essentially, the way that oysters have been fished takes out the living oysters, but also removes the shell from the system, which is the preferred settlement choice for the oyster larvae. It is thought that oyster beds once ringed around the British Isles, as seen in these orange areas on the map, and that we've lost an area of oyster reefs the size of Wales, so quite a lot. So our native oyster is on the path to extinction, and large-scale efforts are required to bring them back, which in turn will benefit people and wildlife. So why restore native oysters? So it's not just for water filtering. Oysters are recognised as ecosystem services, and so that means that they provide a range of services through their hard structures they create and their biological processes. So this infographic shows the provisioning services, the regulating services, and the cultural services. They enhance biodiversity, creating reef habitats with shelter and food for other marine life and wildlife, such as birds. They also increase fish production and support fisheries through the nurseries they create. They have also been an important food source enjoyed by us since Roman times. Essentially, although they're small in size, they're capable of making big changes. So we're entering the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is aiming to prevent and halt and reverse the degradation of ecosystems on every continent, in every ocean, creating a narrative about restoring our ecosystems and pushing the hashtag Generation Restoration if you use Twitter. So how can you restore oyster habitat? So in order to achieve restoration, we first must look at the barriers to oyster population recovery. So the first barrier is a low number of mature and reproducing oysters. Secondly, you also have a lack of suitable habitat to grow on, known as culch, which is that sort of shelly substrate. And thirdly, there's the oysters have been lost from living memory, so people don't remember how common a species they once were. So earlier I touched on why we want to restore native oysters. All of the ecosystem services they provide have benefits on various different stakeholders, including the local economy, recreational fishers, coastal communities, and commercial fishers, as seen in this infographic. So I'll pass back to Celine now.
Thanks, Maria. So yeah, that brought us to basically the reason why we set up the Wild Oysters Project. So the project was set up in June 2020, so we're just coming up to our first year, and we basically partnered. So the Zoological Society of London, the Blue Marine Foundation, and British Marine partnered locally with Bangor University, Conwy Marina, and Ganwy Marina to basically set up your local wild oyster site in Conwy Bay. And the overall aim of the national project is for the UK seas to have self-sustaining populations of native oysters, which in turn can provide us with clean water, healthy fisheries, plentiful biodiversity, and also trying to reignite the national love of this species that once was iconic and a familiar kind of favourite in the coastal communities that we've selected. So just the next slide, please, Maria. So this is just a bit about the kind of background between the partners who went into the funding together to try and receive the funds from the Dream Fund, which is who our funder is. And so ZSL, as we mentioned, is a conservation and education research charity. British Marine is the representative body for the UK marine industry. And Blue Marine Foundation exists to restore the ocean to health. And together, what's brought us together is our kind of passion for oyster restoration, also engagement and outreach to do with marine conservation, and also trying to achieve changes within marine policy as well. Next slide, please, Maria. So this is just a map showing the 3 rehabilitation hubs that we've selected to work within around the UK. So you can see your site on the map there is Conwy Bay. We're also working in Scotland in the Firth of Clyde and in North East England in the Tyne and Wear as well. In the Tyne and Wear, we're working in Sunderland Marina and the Port of Blyth. And in the Firth of Clyde, we're working in Largs Yacht Haven and Fairlie Quay Marina. And then, as I mentioned, in Conwy, we're working in Conwy Marina and Deganwy. And as I mentioned, locally, we are working with the School of Ocean Sciences at Bangor University to deliver this Conwy Restoration Hub. If you wouldn't mind clicking the clicker, Maria. So in total, over the 3 sites, we're aiming to introduce a total of, it's actually that figure's now wrong because we've installed all our nurseries and it comes up to 142. So we've put in 142 oyster nurseries across the 3 sites so far, and we expect those oysters suspended in the nurseries to release billions of oyster larvae over the 3 years of the project. So the way that the oysters are housed in the nurseries that are put underneath the pontoons, in the summer months they'll start to reproduce, breed and release the larvae into the system. So that's first step of the project, and we've now achieved that at all of our 3 sites. The next step is carrying out seabed restoration, and we will be doing that in 3 sites, 1 site locally to each of our selected hubs. We've got a really ambitious engagement programme where we're aiming to reach 50,000 people through the project, and that includes outreach to 12,000 school students, delivering education sessions to them. And also we're hoping to train up a handful of citizen scientists who can help us really get to grips with monitoring our nurseries as well. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Maria, please. So this slide shows on the far left, you can see what an oyster nursery is. It's essentially a micro habitat that houses our oysters for us. And then we've created these really nice, neat hatches in the marina pontoons where they're basically clipped in and secured nice and safely out of the way. And here's just an image of the kind of culch substrate, so that shell substrate that we're hoping to reintroduce to provide a suitable home for our oyster larvae to settle on. And so that's what we're trying to identify at the moment. The sites local to the marinas that we're working in, we're trying to understand more about the seabed, working with local government agencies to try and understand what's possible. And so that's just the stage that we're at the moment, and we're aiming to try and do the seabed restoration in roughly a year's time. As I mentioned, we've got an ambitious outreach and engagement programme whereby we've developed schools materials for Key Stage 3 and 4 students. So we're currently seeking schools to deliver those sessions to. So if anyone has any contacts, we'd be grateful to kind of, if you're interested, we'd be happy to kind of deliver a session, an education session to anyone who'd be of interest. Next slide, please, Maria. So this is just a video that was taken in the Solent, as these nurseries are also set up on the south coast. And this is a nursery that's been in the water for, I think, a fair few months, if not a year or so. And you can see just how much kind of life and things surround the nursery. So often when you pull up these nurseries from underneath the pontoons, a whole ecosystem comes out with it. And that's because they create a mini ecosystem capable of providing a home for lots of different marine species. So I do know that in the Solent nurseries, they found critically endangered species, for example, the Spiny Seahorse and the European eel that's interacting with their nurseries. And here throughout this video, I think you can see a few grey mullet interacting with the nurseries and a few other different fish swimming in and around there. And yeah, in the Solent, they've recorded that their oysters released larvae or babies twice in 1 year. So we'll be coming down to the pontoons, we'll be monitoring the success of the oysters. So you may well see Maria down at the marina kind of bringing up the nursery, and we will be kind of checking up on the oysters and seeing how they're doing. And the aim is for us to also capture some video footage that we're uploading to our website as well. So next slide, and I think I'm handing back over to Maria now.
Cheers, Celine. Okay. So we're excited to have partnered with British Marine. a membership organisation in the UK for leisure super yachts for small commercial marine industry, like Celine was saying. And this has provided us with access to marina pontoons around the UK. So when we were initially looking for sites in Wales, we approached Conwy Marina. They're a British Marine member, and we had a really enthusiastic response from Conwy Marina, which is key for a project like the Wild Oysters Project to succeed. Conwy Marina is aware of their responsibility for the environment and are quite active in seeking new ways to minimise their environmental impact and recognise the importance of building a sustainable future together, which is, you know, great to see and really great to work with. So why Conwy? So Wales once had a prolific fishery for the native oyster, which provided a vital food source to the local coastal communities and contribution to Welsh economy. So locally to Conwy Bay, there were productive native oyster beds during the 18th and 19th centuries in the Menai Strait, near Carnarvon, Bangor, also off Puffin Island and around Anglesey, as well as other areas in Wales, which you can see on the map. Although fishing for native oysters in Wales had begun much earlier, with native oyster shells actually discovered on the Great Orme dating back to the Neolithic and Bronze Age, so about 12,000 years ago. But sadly, only a few small native oyster populations remain in Wales. Conwy itself has a long history of important shellfish production, with a lot of research carried out over the years by the Old Fisheries Experimental Station in Conwy and also by Bangor University. And all this information was vital when determining the local ecology and suitability for native oysters. Conwy Bay is also a special area of conservation because of its unique underwater habitats and important marine plants and animals, such as the large sand and mud flats, which are vital for wintering water birds like the oyster catcher. So we carried out some field work at the end of March, and around 1,300 oysters were delivered from Loch Ryan in Scotland. As a biosecurity measure, Celine and I, along with some student volunteers, scrubbed and cleaned the oysters, firstly to remove any animals or plants that may have been attached to the oyster shell, and transported with those oysters. The oysters were then placed in specially designed nurseries, so the cages that you can see in the image on the presentation. Each nursery holds about 30 oysters, and we have a total of 48 nurseries between Conwy Marina and Ganwy Marina. The project had a very successful regional and national press coverage, sharing the news about the oyster nursery deployment and officially announcing that we were working with Conwy Marina and Ganwy Marina, which was really great to see. So now that the oysters are in the water and with restrictions slowly being lifted, we are recruiting volunteers to assist with the oyster monitoring and to take part in our citizen science programme, as well as book marina site visits with local schools that are interested. So the next monitoring days I've organised are for the 2nd of June in Conwy Marina and the 4th of June in Ganwy Marina. So get in touch, either email me directly, or if you know of someone who may be interested in volunteering, please ask them to send an email to wild.oysters@zsl.org with the subject line Conwy Bay, and it will come to me. Our new Wild Oysters website is also live, so that is at wild-oysters.org. So people can find out more information there about the project and how we plan to deliver our restoration projects across all 3 sites, including Tyne and Wear in England and Firth Clyde in Scotland. Visitors to the site can also help us with our Oyster Watch, with examples of the species that we find living amongst our oyster nurseries. So please do share the word. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. And if you'd like any further information or have any questions, please get in touch and follow the project's progress on Twitter and Instagram. And yeah, look out for myself working in the marina, and feel free to come by and have a chat. Thank you very much. Oh, there we go.
Well, thank you.
No worries. So we can open the floor to any questions. I don't know whether shall I stop the recording now and then the questions? Yeah,
That sounds
I'll
good.
just do
Let's
that,
do that
first. Okie dokie.